or class, we know that there are some groups that have more power currently, right? And that can change somewhat kind of over the course of history. But historically, we've been led to kind of this place where there are groups that have more collective power than others. And so when we think about participation, one of the things that we often use participation for is to try to level out some of that power, right? Or to get voice if there are different individual types of power. Like, how do we get more voice? How do we, this is often where we talk about leveraging power, utilizing power, having access to power. And I think that in the past, we've thought about participation in terms of this kind of power, and how do we get buy-in? How do we get them? How do we either get people who have positional power or more? How do we get folks to buy in to what we're suggesting, right? So Chris's example of your island park piece, like, we're going to come with 3 sets of options for you, right? And we're going to have you participate with us to pick from among our 3 options, right? Often kind of a buy-in. All 3 are okay with us. And so, which would you like, right? Or I come from the world of gender justice and racial justice, and often to get to participation, we would be talking about things like, what are the ground rules we need to set for people to be able to be in this conversation, right? So how do we, as hosts or facilitators, set ground rules, or, you know, in a nice day, how do we help the group set its ground rules? But they probably should be this, this, and this, to participate, right? So I think that there are some things that's actually useful. If there really are only 3 options, don't tell people there are 18, or that they get to make up an option, right? There's some ways that actually can be used with integrity, right? These are our parameters. I use parameters with groups all of the time. We can't always do whatever we want, right? So with the homeless work that I'm doing, one of our first parameters is no new money. No, we can't create a new system that takes more dollars. So don't come back with a model that says we need a lot more beds, because it's not going to happen, right? Those are just, so that's, I think, was a legitimate parameter, right? I think that where we have the opportunity around participation and power over is things like voice. How are we, before we make decisions, bringing voice in? How are we working with different groups of folks as consultants to us and not just people who we want to buy in? How would we help our patients be consultants to us? How do we bring in their voice more fully? How do we actually move into inquiry? Because I find that when we're talking about power over groups, some groups have more power, some groups have less power, or positional power, you're my boss or you're my funder. That's another place that power over shows up a lot in like really kind of squirrely ways. Often we come from a place of knowing. We have to do this before we can move into work. Or this is how it should be. How do we get people to come there with us? And so for me, the next place of participation is, what can we get curious about together? What do we not know? That's often something I will ask groups of people. And especially academics, I'm not going to lie. We'll often say, what do you know for sure? Just because they like to tell you what they know for sure. And then we'll say, and what do you not know? Right? And we're going to go after that, right? Because that's where there's possibility for wider participation being helpful, right? And most people, if there are lots of things, when we're working in complex issues, as every person in this room is, there's lots that we don't know. And so those are the places that participation may be helpful. There is a role for expertise, and expertise gives some power, right? But participation is for those places where you actually can move into inquiry together, where we don't know, where we've got to be agile and flexible. And so I always say, like, the big things, places for inquiry are like things like race and violence and healthcare and those things that we've been working on for years and years and years and still haven't solved. I mean, it could be anything, right? It could be many, many things. But this power over can really benefit from participation when we can really move into inquiry about issues. I think the other piece that I just want to say, because I mentioned ground rules specifically, and I come from background where we talked a lot about setting ground rules before we move into conversations about race. So I was an anti-racism trainer, anti-oppression trainer as part of my work for a number of years. And I really moved this idea of principles, like not ground rules, because often what happens with ground rules is we set the ground rules ahead of time, and then we kind of beat each other up when we don't, when we break the ground rules. It kind of sets us up. It sets us up for this power over. Now I'm the person who can say, you've broken the rule, right? And you're in the group or out of the group, or right? But when we work with principles, we can name those agreements on how we'd like to be together. And so when we name agreements, or we name them as conversations, often what shows up is, oh, right, so we didn't make it that time, right? So how can we learn from that and like move to even more, right? So often, you know, people will talk about a principle of trust, or being trusting or being trustworthy. And we'll all fall short of that at some point. That's just true. And so then what are the conversations around trust that we need to be in? Not trust as a destination or a place to get to, right? But an ongoing conversation for our group and how we are acting with each other that is being trusting or trustworthy. So there's something for me around principles versus ground rules, about inquiry, about voice, that are the places that participation can really make power over. Actually, how do I say? Work, right? Like, so it's not always about, so I'll just say, like my bias and my training is about like down with the hierarchy, right? However, I'm now actually in situations all the time where we can actually have the hierarchy be quite useful, right? It's useful, it helps us do things, it's no longer helpful for me to see hierarchy as the enemy. And so then what are the practices that can help that work actually and move our work forward? And so I would suggest that those are some things. Some of the questions I ask around participation and power over is, how do we shake our certainty and move into inquiry together? How do we hold our certainty lightly and actually really move into inquiry together, especially on those issues that our heart is full around? Those can be, it's really easy for me to be in inquiry around something for me that's I just don't like, that's big with moms in my area, are like the snacktivism thing, right? Like, so being snack activists, right? And like school snacks are wrong and camp snacks are wrong. Awesome, right? Like, I'm super glad someone's doing that work. It is not my work to do. It just isn't. So I can be really curious. What's that mean for you? Like, what would that look like? I can, like, that's super easier for me to be curious about. Right? Right. How could we transport kale chips to the soccer field? So I can get like that's super easy for me to just be curious about. But if you ask me about how we end infant mortality among Black children in my community, because my community happens to have like double the national average of infant mortality in a really prosperous community, like, I don't feel a lot of curiosity. I want you to fix it. I want you to fix it so my babies don't die, right? And so it's really much harder for me to feel like, oh, I'm curious, right? What would that look like if we, you know, like, and so like those things that we care about, it can be a lot harder to get curious about. So I'm interested, the question for me is, how do we shake our certainty, right? About those things we care most about. Like, what are my most deeply valued, you know, beliefs? And how do I shake that and let me go into inquiry together? Because I think that I don't know how we solve infant mortality, for example. I have to do it with participation in other people. I have to. I don't know. Another question is that our colleague Kelly McGowan and Chris and I have been in for several years. It's like, what's the next conversation we want to have about race or social justice, right? Like, not the conversation we've been having for the past 20 years. Right? Like, what's the next one, right?
20 years, that's a really recent.
Last 100 years.
Exactly, right? Sometimes I think if I hear one more 10 tips to being an ally conversation, I'm going to throttle someone, right? Not really, because I'm anti-violence, but I'm just saying. Right? So, like, what's the next conversation that moves us beyond where we've been? And I think I just wanted to name kind of one practice, so some of those voice inquiry principles are some things to consider. One of the practices that I try to cultivate in groups that I'm working with when there's power differentials, or powers in the room, and power is like really alive, which is almost every room, but is this this practice of multiplicity, letting people show up in their multiple roles or identities or ways of being. Because often, especially in the power over conversation, we begin to essentialize each other. You're not Phyllis who likes polka dots and is from the Midwest. You're Phyllis who represents this organization. Or you're Phyllis, my boss. Or you're, there are all sorts of ways we kind of essentialize people. And so the practice is letting people's multiplicity show up and letting them, be actually quite honest. Yes, I don't know if you're a CEO. Yes, you're a CEO, and, right, that's a piece of who you are. And, so I don't like to label people, so I'm just going to say for me. So I happen to be, this makes me laugh, but it's true, I happen to be the president of my company. So I could, that's part of me. I'm also a mother, I'm also a runner, I'm biracial, I'm a cisgendered woman. There are all sorts of different ways I can show up in the world, but often I'm invited to meetings because I'm the black host, right? So I gotta have something to say, right? And I don't, it's all right, right? I'd rather you have a black host than not have a black host, but it's just so that's kind of essentializing me, right? Right? But we do that all of the time when we're coming up with collaborations. Who do we need to have? What voices do we need to have represented? I'm not saying we don't go for diversity, friends. I'm just saying, when you invite me as the black host, please also invite me as Tuesday and as mother and as, all these different things. But, that sounds great. But that means letting all of the person show up at every meeting, right? It's not just at the beginning. Right? So I'm inviting you because of this. Often I invite people in because of their influence. Right? We want you at this meeting because of what you can influence. But I don't that's not the only reason you're here. Often I'll start those meetings with, why does it matter that you're here? Right? Because I want all of you here. And so part of your influence is maybe part of it. Part of it might be the way you think about things, the way you're able to see things from your position. Right? So inviting multiplicity. So that's power over